You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
For this week's episode of the e-flux podcast, we are featuring Masha Gessen's lecture, How We Survive an Autocracy, originally given on May 24th, 2017, as part of an ongoing e-flux lecture series dedicated to discovering the protocols of 21st century truth, assuming that these still exist. Masha Gessen is a journalist and author whose most recent book, The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, won the 2017 National Book Award for Nonfiction. This lecture was originally introduced by Stephen Squibb, reading an excerpt from Gessen's national bestseller, The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin.
Thank you. I've never actually been introduced by a reading of my own text. That was really cool. Thank you. And what made it cool was that I wrote that book 5 years ago, or actually that book came out 5 years ago, and I actually liked hearing that because I've just finished reading my latest book for the second time, sort of straight through for the edits, and I'm convinced it is the most boring thing that anyone has ever written. And you have just given me a little bit of confidence, so thank you very much for doing that. But what I'm going to do today is revisit something that I have a lot more confidence about than my books, which is a piece that I wrote on election night. And I think we talked about the topic of this lecture months ago and sort of decided that we would call it the same thing that I called that piece. And I thought, well, why not actually go back and see what I wrote? The story of that piece is kind of instructive. On election night, I was actually on call at the New York Times. They had a bunch of people around the world ready to write about the world's reaction to the election of Hillary Clinton, which was the only package that the New York Times had put together for election night, which is extraordinary because, one of the first things that I learned when I became a journalist when I was a child was that you never do that. You never presume an outcome. You never actually assume that you know what's going to happen before it's actually happened, because there are earthquakes, floods, acts of God, and acts of man that will destroy the best laid plans. But what happened on the night of November 8th was that around 1:30 in the morning, I wrote to the editor on duty, who's someone I'd never worked with before, because actually the senior people had gone home, I think. And I wrote to him saying, I don't think I should be writing about the reaction in Russia. I think I'd rather write a piece on how to survive an autocracy. Because at that point, I was already starting to get panicked messages from acquaintances in my inbox saying, what do we do now? You've been there. Which, seemed a pretty odd premise, because obviously I've had to flee Russia twice. So I'm clearly the person to really tell you how to survive this stuff. I probably wouldn't know a successful strategy if it stared me in the face. But anyway, that's as close to having expertise as probably anybody has come. And so I said, I'd like to write a piece on how to survive an autocracy. And the editor on duty said, we should probably wait until we have final results. And I thought that was very optimistic of him, and I said, well, I can make the piece provisional. He said, nah. So I wrote the piece and sent it to the New York Review of Books, and it came out about 36 hours later. And the reason I remember that was because I was getting on my bike in Queens to ride home to Harlem, and they had just posted the piece. And by the time I had gotten home, my smartwatch was fried from the number of retweets that were coming across. It actually had overheated and died, so that was the loss I suffered, but there were some gains. So I don't actually think, and I didn't think at the time, that I had lessons to impart in the sense of, as I said, I don't think that we in Russia ever found a successful strategy. But I think I have an advantage in the sense that I've spent years trying to think about this, and also because I spent so many years covering Russian politics and covering Putin in particular, I have a particular set of optics that I've developed. And there are things I see. These are not necessarily, they don't necessarily testify to sort of innate similarities between Russia and the United States or Putin and Trump. They are just particular optics that you develop, I think, in that political situation. And people who covered Berlusconi for many years, like the wonderful journalist Alexander Stille, he has a similar thing that he developed in the course of covering Berlusconi. And people who have written about the European reversals of democracy in the 1930s also have a similar trick that they can perform. So I was putting down on paper some thoughts that I've had over the many years that I've been training my eyes to see the stuff that I would rather leave unseen. So I'm going to run through those rules now and see what's happened to them. So rule number 1 was believe the autocrat. And like all those rules, it's a little problematic. And what I was talking about was something that I think was prevalent sort of during the election campaign, but also something that I saw happen in Russia a lot, which is a systematic failure of the imagination. Right? The reason that we couldn't conceive of Trump winning the election was that we couldn't imagine Trump winning the election. In fact, often when I got into arguments with people, especially in the spring and summer of 2016, about what was going to happen in the election, that would be the ultimate argument. I just can't imagine Republicans nominating him, people would say. And I would think, well, that's the start of the conversation. The fact that you can't imagine something happening is your failure. And it is a common failure. It's a common failure for human beings. It's a common failure for citizens. If we can't imagine something happening, that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It just means we're not going to be prepared to deal with it happening, right? And in Russia, I saw that happen a lot as well. People would say, well, Putin is not really going to act like the person he appears to be. He's going to act like someone else, which became a trope here when people would advance very seriously the entirely unfounded argument that Trump was going to become presidential the moment that he entered office. As a matter of fact, and Evan Osnos actually wrote a terrific piece about this in the New Yorker in September, so 2 months before the election, a piece on how consistent presidential candidates tend to be. How, in fact, 70 to 80% of campaign promises are generally carried out as policy once the candidate becomes president. That the common trope of campaigning in poetry and governing in prose is just that, a trope, and is misleading. But so that rule, believe the autocrat, is a rule for imagining the worst, which growing up in Russia and also being a journalist in Russia really prepares you to do. That's the best training you can have for imagining the worst, which is, I think I was so convinced that Trump was going to win. Obviously, no one could have predicted a victory of won by 77,000 votes in 3 counties. Right? It was not my incredible power of prediction. It was just my absolute conviction that when the worst is staring you in the face, it's going to happen. But clearly, believing Trump is an oxymoron because he lies all the time. Right? So how do you believe somebody? How do you follow my rule, he means what he says, when in fact, even though he means what he says, most of what he says when it relates to facts is a lie. So that's complicated. I'm not going to try to defend that very simple formulation of believe the autocrat. I think probably that rule should be imagine the worst. Right? And sort of try to do the work of logically arguing your way through your imagination from the information that you have. I think that the information that we had when Trump was campaigning was that there were certain things that were important to him. Those things were immigration. Those things were Muslims. And so the wall, and if you recall early on, when he said, well, maybe some of the wall is not actually going to be a physical wall, that seemed so hopeful, because like some of it was going to be chicken wire, and that like makes all the difference. But of course, the important part there was that this was somebody who was going to unleash a war on the enemy within, on immigrants in this country. That has already happened. And understanding that would help us understand what's happening. I think there's been some coverage, but not nearly enough, of the changes in the work of ICE, and also the change in the lived experience of being an immigrant in this country, or somebody who has anything less than a U.S. passport. My friends who have green cards are afraid to travel abroad. They're here legally. They have every right to be here, but their lawyers have advised them to postpone any border crossings until things settle down, whenever that might be. There are asylum seekers in this country who are convinced that this country has stopped issuing asylum, which is not true. The asylum system has not actually changed. What has changed is the deportation system, the priorities that are set for ICE in deporting people. The Obama era, not that the Obama era was particularly good for deportations. We deported more people under Obama than ever before. And the ground was actually laid for the Trump era of deportations. But at least there was this policy of disregarding sort of low priority potential deportees. That policy has been thrown out the window, so now anybody who can legally be deported is a high priority for getting deported, right? So we're into what inevitably becomes inconsistent selective enforcement, right? Which is basically an internal war on immigrants in this country, and that's already happening. And we kind of have to exercise an imagination of the present to fully grasp that. Rule number 2 was do not be taken in by small signs of normality. That's my favorite. That really turned out to be prescient. Human beings adapt. I think that really is one of the things that makes us human. I think that every time, and I've certainly lived this, right? Every time something happens and you really feel like it's going to be intolerable, you are not going to be able to live with this. And then guess what? You wake up the next morning and the sun has come up and the world has not ended. In fact, it has not ended yet. And so that experience of the world not ending is probably going to be repeated over and over again. And that was what Obama said right after the election, right? He said the sun is still going to come up tomorrow. And those were really words of encouragement for being taken in by small signs of normality. We endlessly adapt. We endlessly like to think that things are not as bad as they seemed just yesterday. And we have certainly observed this over and over again. I mean, the examples are numerous. Some of the obvious ones are, that time that Trump was able to read from the teleprompter for the first time, and during the joint address to Congress, and he staged that 125 seconds of shame, or actually national pride, when he compelled members of Congress to stand up and applaud the widow of the fallen Navy SEAL, and then said that they'd set some sort of record by applauding for so long. And then Van Jones on CNN said he became president of the United States at that point. So there's actually something really interesting that happened. I've watched that clip of Van Jones over and over again because I'm going to be using it every time I teach. It's this remarkable thing that he does that is pretty typical of American journalism, which teaches you that there's always like a central issue, and then there are two positions equidistant from that central question, right? So Van Jones said there are those people who have been wishing that Trump would always be the insane clown. And then there's, I'm paraphrasing, but pretty close to the text, and he said, and then there are those people who have been wishing that he would become president of the United States, like of all the people of the United States. And today, he became president of all the people of the United States. And what that communicated, which is inevitable actually in sort of the framework of American journalism, what that communicated is that the center is now Trump. Right. And that's the new normal. And then there are positions equally credible positions that are a certain distance removed from Trump in one direction and in the other direction. Right? And then there's this conceit that there are only two directions and that the center is what's in power and Trump is in power. And then we heard that Trump had become presidential for the second time when he fired 59 Tomahawk missiles at Syria, and that was Fareed Zakaria who said that he had become presidential. But most interestingly to me, actually, is what happened around the 100-day mark a couple of weeks ago, when there was a whole slew of opinion pieces and sort of punditry on television saying, look, the world hasn't ended. He hasn't scored a single legislative victory. This was the day before the House vote to repeal the Affordable Care Act. He's appointed a sane person to the Supreme Court, and the sun still comes up every morning. So the conclusion drawn by a lot of people was he is just incompetent and not a fascist, which is a false opposition if ever I saw one. Because the very sort of the intellectual foundation of fascism is actually this idea that government and politics are unnecessarily complicated. It is aggressive ignorance. It is militant oversimplification. And so incompetence is the other side of the coin of fascism. You don't read it in history books a lot because when historians narrate history and when we read history, we like to think that the monster behind the world's greatest catastrophes was as great as the catastrophe itself. Because it's so much more frightening to think that people humanity just stumbled into its darkest moments. But when we're actually in the process of stumbling into one of humanity's darkest moments, it is a really important thing to remember, and that's why it pays to read contemporary accounts rather than historical accounts of the darkest moments. And I think that we're going to be seeing this again and again. This sort of sigh of relief every time something doesn't happen. Which brings me to rule number 3, which is institutions will not save you. The institution that I focused on in that piece was the national press. And I was writing that, look, he's going to, there's no law that says that he has to have, there have to be daily White House briefings. There's no law that there has to be a presidential press pool. There's no law that actually holds government and the presidency accountable. That's all cultural norms. And going back to my previous point, when we take an accounting of the damage done by looking at legislation or looking at sort of quantifiable damage to institutions, we ignore the much more lasting damage to culture, to political culture, that has been done and that is being done. But so much as we have learned, in the last 7 months. So much of what we take for granted is actually norm and not law. But even what is law will only be enforced by institutions when there is sufficient pressure on those institutions to do their jobs. And that's, an example of that is the travel ban, right? That was a brilliant and so far singular example of civic resistance and institutional resistance to something that this administration does, right? I mean, it looked like it was played out according to some script with protesters in the streets and professional civil society, the ACLU, filing suit, and the courts stepping up. And we know now, thanks to some excellent journalism, that the courts wouldn't have stepped up or wouldn't have stepped up as sort of decisively and as fast had it not been for the pressure from civil society. That's a really important thing to keep in mind, right? Without that pressure, institutions will not actually be resilient. But there are some places where institutions actually just don't exist for enforcing what we have taken for granted, and that is, again, the press. And I mean, this is obviously also what I know best, so I'm attuned to subtle changes. But we have seen, for example, the Secretary of State just canceled this whole idea of the press pool that travels with the Secretary of State. Which is an amazing thing because, and he has said that when he wants to communicate something, he'll find a way to do it. Which is the CEO's view of the press, right? If he needs to do some messaging, he'll contact you, but he doesn't have a concept of being accountable to the public, and the press being an instrument of that accountability. That is the only way to know what the Secretary of State is doing. It is also often the only way to know what the president is doing, which is why we often learn about what the president is doing from the foreign media, including the Russian media. But it's also been both invigorating and deadening to the media. I mean, the day after the election, or in the days after the election, some of the newsrooms in this town felt like morgues. I've heard, I wasn't actually at the New York Times the day after, but I saw friends who were in the newsroom and said that it was deathly quiet, and there was this general sense that something horrible had happened, not just to the country, but to the very institution that they were in. I was at ProPublica a couple of days after the election, and it very much felt like that. And I mean, people were in tears. And the thing that people said most often was, nothing we do matters. Facts don't matter. Truth doesn't matter. I think that some people, actually an encouraging number of journalists, have gotten really angry after being really sad. And have done some amazing work, including ProPublica, which has just been on fire the entire time. But I think there's an important insight there in this idea that facts don't matter and nothing we do matters, which is that there's what Trump does, and this has been seen elsewhere before, but I don't think it's ever been seen, well, it hasn't been seen in this generation in this country. I've seen it in Putin. I know that people saw it with Berlusconi. What Trump does when he lies is entirely different from what other people, other politicians, or your children do when they lie. Which is that he doesn't try to bring you around to believing something that's not true. What he does is he asserts power over reality. It's on a certain level, it's a bully tactic. It's the kid in your playground who stole your lunchbox, and you say, "Give me back my lunchbox," and he says, "I don't have it," and you say, "It's in your left hand," and he said, "There's nothing in my left hand," and what are you going to do about it? And that's what he communicates all the time. What are you going to do about it? I have a bigger microphone. In fact, he said that he needed a big microphone in order to be able to finally talk back to the lying press. On another level, he's also, because he's president and not just a playground bully, he's also asserting every time that he is not just president of the country, but king of reality. When he says that millions of people voted illegally, when he says that President Obama had him wiretapped, that's what he's doing. Right? And it does create an impossible situation for the press, because obviously fact-checking him doesn't work. We should have figured out that fact-checking him doesn't work sooner, right around the time that the Washington Post came to the conclusion that he lied 91% of the time. That might have been a clue to writing a bigger story about what Trump is doing, rather than taking satisfaction from fact-checking every one of his statements and saying, that's not true, and that's not true, and that's not true. And he gets a gazillion Pinocchios. But we have to find a way to write the bigger story every time, the bigger story of the lying president, the bigger story of the president who insists on living in a different reality and who tries to force that reality upon us. And that creates a whole bunch of problems. It creates a problem of storytelling. It also creates a problem of language, because one of the things that Trump is doing is attacking language on a regular basis through two distinct ways. And I think I'm not sure that I've ever seen actually those two things sort of combine in quite this way. Usually you see one or the other happening. So what he does is he uses words to mean their opposite. And you've read about this in 1984. We certainly lived through it in the Soviet Union when, for example, we had this thing called the free expression of citizen will, which is when you were required to go to a polling place and check off the one name that was next to each office. So there was nothing free. There was nothing. There was no expression. It was not a civic act, and there was no will involved. But it was called the free expression of citizen will. Prison is liberty, etc. So Trump does that. He does that with other kinds of words. He does that with words that have to do with power relationships. Right? So he, for example, used the phrase "safe space" when he said that the vice president should have been protected when he went to the theater in New York City, because the theater should be a safe space. And safe space is a phrase that's actually used to describe spaces for people who generally feel unsafe in public to go to and feel safe in a small, non-public space, right? So he turns it on its head. He says that the second most powerful man in the world should be made to feel safe in public by the creation of a safe space. Or my favorite, of course, is witch hunt, right? Which he uses over and over again to say that he, the most powerful man in the world, is the object of a witch hunt organized by losers. Right? Losers can't actually organize a witch hunt. You have to have power to carry out a witch hunt. And, maybe we can do without words like witch hunt and safe space, although I'd rather keep them, they're nice. But this is a particular kind of threat to language when words are used to mean their opposite. But he also does something else, which is that he uses language to mean nothing, right? And he just and unfortunately I didn't bring a quote, and there's no way to reproduce it because it escapes your brain the moment you try to memorize it, because it's just stuff. It's a pile of words. The problem with that is that and I think to me it's an even bigger problem than Trump's tweets, right? Trump's tweets, some people have argued for not paying attention to his tweets, et cetera. I think that's kind of silly. Trump's tweets are a fact of public life and should certainly be covered, and they're actually valuable to us, I think, to journalists and to the public in general. But Trump's piles of words should not ideally be respected as expression by journalists. But how can you not respect it as expression of as expression if it comes out of the president's mouth? And in particular, like when a journalist is sitting across from the president and interviewing him, what does a journalist do? Generally speaking, the journalist acts respectful and says yes or right or asks follow-up questions, like something was said, right, when nothing was actually said. Of identifiable substance. And then newspapers report on it. So I don't actually have a solution, as you may have guessed from all the other stuff I've said, but I think it's at least useful to identify the problem. And it is at least useful to then reconsider what the role of the media is in the situation, which is that if we think of ourselves as objective observers of reality, or people who just report what's out there, it's always been irresponsible, but it is just fantastically irresponsible now. And I think the journalists need to think of ourselves as guardians of the public sphere. And for now, this country actually has a pretty good public sphere. And one of the ways that we disrespect the public sphere is by saying that everybody lives in a bubble, there's a right-wing bubble and a left-wing bubble. That's not actually borne out by the information that we have. There are people who live sort of in the fairly broad spectrum from about center-right to about center-left, are routinely, if they consume media, and they do consume media, exposed to opinions that they don't share, and routinely see answers to questions that they didn't ask. If I read the New York Times, I get mad, and I write for the New York Times. Right? And that's good. The spectrum of opinions presented in the New York Times is pretty broad. It's not boundless. It should not be boundless. Maybe it should be shifted. But it's broad. And that is a healthy public sphere, not a perfect public sphere. People who live in the Breitbart bubble, and that unfortunately includes the president, are not, in fact, exposed to opinions that they don't share, and do not, in fact, get answers to questions that they didn't ask. And if you look at sort of their web behavior and other media that they consume, you will see that. You will see that there's no sort of cross-pollination, as there is for the larger number of Americans. And that needs to be protected. But in order to protect it, we have to at least understand it's out there and not use irresponsible phrases like "we all live in bubbles." Rule number 4 is actually related to rule number 2 about normality. Rule number 4 is be outraged. I think that's sort of the rule that really went viral because it sounds like so much fun, and it is not. And I did write that. I wrote that it gets really tired, and it also gets really tiresome for the people around you. And it's not fun to be the hysteric in the room all the time. And there are all sorts of counter-arguments that you hear, like, look, he's just incompetent, or look, they have had no legislative gains. Or they're not going to repeal the Affordable Care Act because I can't imagine that they will. I've heard this from a number of healthcare professionals. And it's also, being outraged is not normal. And the reason it's not the fact that it's not normal is one of the reasons that we've now acquired the phrase Trump derangement syndrome, which is the apparently reasonable argument that people who are outraged, who insist on being outraged by Trump, are outraged by everything he does, including the right things that he does. That's a really interesting question. It's an interesting question. Should you be outraged by something that Trump does right, just because Trump did it? I think there's a really good argument to be made for being outraged by something that Trump does right, just because Trump did it. And part of the reason that it's a good, I'll give some examples. The 59 Tomahawk missiles going to Syria in response to the chemical weapons attack. From what we know now, it was actually advocated by H.R. McMaster, who, until he started defending Trump for probably reasons that he thinks are very good, he was one of the most revered people in the entire national security establishment, an intellectual, somebody who wrote a book about the failure of American generals to speak up about Vietnam. Really the kind of person I would want to see be national security advisor, if only it weren't under President Trump. But the problem with the Syrian strike when it is carried out by President Trump is that the interpretation that is immediately given to it by Fareed Zakaria, as I mentioned, he said that Trump was being presidential, and then he continued to say that Trump was now pursuing a values-based foreign policy in the tradition of whatever. Because, of course, Trump doesn't pursue any policy in any tradition. Trump, like most autocrats, governs by gesture, right? That is something that is very difficult for us to assimilate. Right? It's not the way we're used to talking about politics. It's not the way we're used to writing about politics. It actually makes writing and talking about politics almost meaningless, because these are discontinuous gestures, right? These are the way that I think they work for him is he advances his presidential brand, right? So a gesture is keeping supposedly 800 carrier jobs. Remember that in the United States? And it doesn't scale. It doesn't reflect policy. He blackmailed and bribed Carrier into keeping those jobs in the United States, and it's a tiny number, but it's a gesture, and it demonstrates that he's in charge. And the 59 Tomahawk missiles going to Syria is exactly the same thing, and it doesn't reflect policy, and it doesn't reflect anything on Trump's part except his desire to demonstrate that he is in charge. And then he sees how well it plays on TV, and it plays spectacularly well on TV if you're like me and you subject yourself to CNN every time you stay in a hotel room, which is most of the time, then you would really have been struck by what happened, how the picture on television changed. Like the actual picture, right? The day before those missiles flew, the picture on CNN was a lot of talking heads, and there would be like 4 or 5 smart people and a Trump supporter, and they would all be screaming at each other. And then it was just Nikki Haley, his UN ambassador, doing a one-on-one interview for what felt like hours on end. And 2 days before, I was actually in New York at Lincoln Center at the Women in the World Summit, and where Nikki Haley was interviewed on stage. And she was laughed off the stage because she sounded like what she is, which is a woman who is just discovering that the world exists. And she, at one point, she got this really softball question about soft power, and she said, "We don't do soft power." And the audience laughed and then booed. And there she was 2 days later on CNN saying the exact same thing, but we now knew what it meant. We don't do soft power means we just fire the missiles. And then when Trump sees that it plays so well on TV, he makes another gesture, which is drop the mother of all bombs on Afghanistan. Is that and then everybody tries to figure out what kind of policy that represents, but it doesn't represent any kind of policy, right? And that is why I think it is right and accurate to be outraged by things that are done by President Trump, even if those things done by someone else might have been right, or you might have found yourself supporting them. So rule number 5 is the problematic one. Rule number 5 is don't make compromises. And I think originally it was actually phrased differently. It was even more problematic, and then my editor changed it, and that's wonderful that he did that. I probably would change it even more, because I don't know that that I'm really advocating for not making any compromises. What I'm trying to get across is that we don't actually know what the right thing to do is, right? Except for in the vaguest terms, right? Be outraged. Do not be taken in by small signs of normality. It is impossible to prescribe our behavior in an unpredictable and abnormal situation, or probably in any situation. We do have the ability to know what the wrong thing to do is. And that is an ability that we sort of need to cultivate in this situation. What I would do, and what I would encourage everybody to do, is to think about things that would be wrong to the current you, or better yet, to the you before Trump got elected, and maybe write them on a piece of paper and put them in a drawer. What I have in mind is perhaps not the people in this room so much, although it may get to the point where it affects the people in this room as well. But it certainly has affected me in very small ways. But like, I was writing a column last night. It was for the New York Times, so I had to put Mr. Trump in every time that I had to say Mr. Trump every time I mention Trump, and it makes me cringe. It's too respectful. Right? For another publication, I would just be able to say Trump. And it's a very itty-bitty small thing, but actually, the issue of sort of the respect for a particular person versus a respect for people in general, the issue of respect for the office versus the respect for the person who occupies it, these are actually meaningful issues that people who don't even work for state institutions need to examine. But in particular, I'm really thinking about people who work for government agencies. Somebody who administers grants at the National Endowment for Humanity, somebody who works the Russia desk at the State Department, and is at this point forced to lie, probably thinking that the lie is that they're lying for a noble cause. When, say, somebody comes by your office and says, is the Secretary of State ever going to make a statement about the imprisonment and murders of gay men in Chechnya? And the person who works the Russia desk at the State Department maybe says, that's not out of the question. We're committed to protecting human rights. Nothing has changed in that respect. And that person is lying. It is out of the question. And the State Department is no longer committed to protecting human rights, except to the extent that low-level program officers who have not yet been fired because they're career diplomats rather than political appointees, except to the extent that they can continue to do their jobs in spite of Rex Tillerson, who has said openly that human rights is no longer a priority. And that abstract program officer is probably thinking that he or she is doing the right thing by buying herself or himself another day in that job in which maybe he or she can do some marginal good. But that is the kind of compromise that I'm talking about, and it's a really, really difficult dilemma. And another example of the same thing is H.R. McMaster trying to issue a non-denial denial of the Washington Post story about Trump revealing intelligence information to Russians during the meeting, and saying the story as reported is wrong, and or the premise of the story is wrong, which is basically a roundabout way of saying the story is right, but I need to defend the president, and I'm going out in front of the press because the people whose job it is to protect the president are no longer credible, right? Because if it were Sean Spicer or what's her name, yeah, see, that would happen. And And H.R. McMaster probably thinks that that's the best thing he can do for the country. But here's somebody who has been, who's so highly respected for being a man of integrity and a man of intellectual integrity, who's selling that integrity out, again, I think because he thinks that it's for the good of the country. And to me, it was a heartbreaking spectacle, and I can only imagine what it feels like to him. And I think that, and this gets back to the be outraged point, I think there's a reason my first book was about the Russian intelligentsia, in particular, a lot of it was about the dissidents in the Soviet Union. And they were all pretty weird people. They were, I had the lovely experience once of being able to give Alexander Yesenin-Volpin, who was really the founder in some key ways of the Soviet dissident movement, certainly the founder of the protest part of it, the street protest part of it. I gave him his papers, his pages from his legal file that said that he was that he was mentally ill because he believed that he could effect change in the Soviet Union. And he was just delighted. He was, he'd been living in the States for 30 years by that point, and he said, well, of course I was. And he was. I mean, it is not normal to believe that you can effect change in the Soviet Union, especially that you can effect change by saying stuff or going out into the streets. You have to be certifiably insane. And he was, in fact, the reason he was so delighted was because he found out that he had been certified insane for the right thing. But unless you're certifiably insane and for that reason, comfortable with being not normal in a society, it is a very painful predicament to find yourself in. The predicament of being outraged and the predicament of trying not to make compromises, or as I would probably phrase it now, don't do the wrong thing. And so finally, point 6 is my favorite because it sounds a little bit optimistic, and it's remember the future. And remember the future is, it's a reminder that nothing lasts forever. Donald Trump is 71 years old. I don't think that this is going to end soon or well, but it will end. And it's really important to think about how we enter the post-Trump future. That is really, of all the things that I've written, that's the one that I derive most directly from my experience of living in Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed. I grew up in the Soviet Union when I was 14. I came to this country, and then I went back as a journalist in 1991 and stayed there for more than 20 years. And it was, in a way for me, it was more than 20 years of coming to understand how impossible it is for a profoundly damaged society to recover. How every step of the way you encounter something that has been ravaged or just murdered or just irreparably damaged by what's happened. And that includes language, it includes social bonds, it includes political culture, it includes the basic understanding of politics, and there's been a lot of damage that's already been done to American political culture and American language. In fact, I think a lot of that damage has been done over the last 16 years and made Trump possible. But unless we look at that and unless we understand what kind of damage has already been done and what kind of damage is being done, we're going to come out unable to recover. Right? And so this is a plea for paying attention to language and being intentional in the use of language. It's also a plea for paying attention to institutions and the practice of politics. Right? There are certain things that can only be done once, like this idea of remember the Hamilton electors? One of the worst ideas ever. The idea that we could avoid Trump by getting members of the Electoral College to vote against him, in violation of many state laws, and that's the sort of thing that you can do if you're never going to have another presidential election. But if you're actually going to have another one, even if you get rid of the Electoral College in the meantime, you can't do that. You can't change the rules of election during an election if you're actually planning to have a democracy afterward. I feel the same way about the idea of having Trump removed from office by some group of psychiatrists who swoop in and declare him incompetent. I'm certainly old enough to remember being considered a psychopathic personality because I was queer, and not being able to apply for U.S. citizenship actually in the 1980s because I had entered this country illegally. My family entered, we all had refugee status, but because I already knew that I was queer, technically it was illegal for me to then apply for citizenship because I had entered under false pretenses because I would have been required to disclose the fact that I had a psychopathic personality. So I'm not a fan of institutional psychiatry saving us from perceived insanity just this one time, because then it will happen again. At the same time, we can also go into that post-Trump future with a robust civil society that has been reinvigorated by this presidency. This country, for a number of very strange reasons, including the distrust of the state, has the wealthiest and vastest civil society in the world, and that's something that can be carried forward. We can enter it with amazing journalism. Can maybe enter it with a vision of the future, which would probably have been the way to defeat a campaign run on the imaginary past. And it wasn't advanced, but it could be advanced as we enter the future. And so on that falsely positive note, I will end and take questions.